So this is a Zoom webinar. All attendees are muted with the exception of the panelists. Panelists include myself, our student team, and our speakers, Patricia Song and Elizabeth Barnard. We are taking questions throughout the talk. Please utilize the Q&A function on Zoom for questions or ask the Spanish moderator. We will respond during the talk or ask the speakers to do so. If we run short on time, we will respond after the talk. This talk will be immediately available on our UCLA Pritzker Center page on Facebook and posted on a YouTube channel and Twitter account within 72 hours. If you didn't RSVP and would like future resources, please add your name and email to the chat. We will add you to our lists. If you are a student joining and you need proof of attendance, please put a note in at the end of the talk with your name, email, school, and professor's email. We will send proof of attendance after the talk. Finally, a note on geography. We are based at UCLA in Los Angeles, California. Consequently, the majority of our work revolves around Los Angeles County systems. Understanding folks are joining us from across North America, we will do our best to share information that is relevant to all jurisdictions. Now for introductions. On behalf of the UCLA Pritzker Center, my name is Taylor Dudley. You will also see our students, Floor and Brittany, on the talk, as well as our program coordinator, Ruby Tucker, on the screen. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 7th installment of our community speakers on COVID-19. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Elizabeth Barnard, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine and Pediatrician for Juvenile Court Health Services, and Patricia Song, Director of Youth Justice Policy and Senior Staff Attorney for Children's Defense Fund of California. Let's welcome our speakers and turn to our first question. So let's go ahead and start with Patricia. Patricia, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself and just tell us a little bit about the type of work you do?
Sure. So the Children's Defense Fund California's youth justice work focuses on a number of goals to achieve systems change around youth justice, to reduce young people's contact with the justice system as much as possible, to shrink that system, which has grown so much over time and consumes so many resources, to really shift those resources into what we believe works better. That's holistic youth development. That is really strength-based, community-based, and holistic, and is really a better way to achieve both youth wellness as well as community safety and healing. And then to ensure that there is accountability and transparency around all systems, whether it's a government system or a community system, that there needs to be transparency and accountability of those systems. And in order for that to happen, that the leadership of young people and communities, especially those that have been system impacted, are at the center of those accountability systems. So that's what we do as a youth justice system, both in LA County and at the state level. My background is as a juvenile defense attorney. I've represented young people at every level, at trial, on appeal, and post-conviction matters. Started as a lawyer representing young people sentenced to life without parole. So in the most serious of cases, with the most serious sentence that they can possibly receive. And prior to that, worked with organizing groups around the country and actually in the foundational world, supporting youth justice work and social justice work around the country.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It's an honor to have you here. Dr. Barnard, would you also please tell us about your background and the work that you do?
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining. My name is Liz Barnard. I'm a pediatrician at UCLA. I'm an assistant professor of pediatrics in the department, and with most of my time, I do research that focuses on the intersection between juvenile justice and health, and also do work with other socially vulnerable youth. And then through a contract between UCLA and Department of Health Services in LA County, I do my clinical work at Barry J. Neidorff Juvenile Hall.
Thank you so much. Liz, can you share some of the unique health issues that youth in the juvenile halls or juvenile facilities are facing during this time?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that question, and I already warned the panelists that I have a bit of a long answer because this is a huge issue and unlike any that we've ever faced before. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot. So, you know, particularly because there's also people outside of LA County, and just to help everyone conceptualize this, I just want to step back and talk about some of the public health issues at play and the population sizes, the epidemiology, the scope of the issue that we're talking about. So, first thing I want everybody to know is that in the United States, there's about 44,000 kids less than 18 who are incarcerated. I know the title of this talk is Youth Justice, but I also want to remind us that about 1 in 10 incarcerated youth are in adult facilities, and COVID-19 is really outbreaking a lot in the adult facilities. I'll give you guys some numbers. In Los Angeles County, there's about 600 kids in our juvenile justice facilities, in the halls and the camps. In terms of the adult population, so people 18 and over in correctional facilities, in the United States, there's 2.3 million people in U.S. adult correctional facilities. And I know this isn't the topic of today's talk, but I know that we all care a lot about children. I want to remind everyone that there's 2.7 million children in the United States who have a parent currently incarcerated, 1 in 9 Black children. So everything that we hear about adult settings is impacting children as well. So I think it's really important to understand the vulnerabilities of correctional settings to COVID-19. They are essentially, you can think of them like a cruise boat in that they have a contained population. But worse than a cruise boat, actually more dangerous, because you have movement, daily ingress and egress of people out of the facilities at just a high enough rate to create great danger. This isn't from anybody's fault. This isn't negligence. It's just the public health issues of outbreaks in corrections. There have been outbreaks in corrections for, you know, all of time, for as long as we've had correctional facilities, but none in modern times that are already at the scope of COVID-19. So there's this movement issue, and then within correctional facilities, there are inherent challenges to social distancing and to quarantine. And, you know, a little bit more worrisome in adult facilities compared to youth facilities. Adult facilities in the United States are severely overcrowded. So Men's Central Jail in Los Angeles County has been undergoing population size reductions. The most recent figure I heard is it's still at 130% capacity. So for LA County Juvenile Justice, we have the strength that the county has been working hard for a long time to reduce the population size, so the facilities are not overcrowded, but thinking about this broadly, that is a concern. And then there's also issues with access to hygiene and ability to carry out hygiene. So having access to soap, water, hand sanitizer, time in your routine to be able to wash your hands, and then also access to personal protective equipment. And the last kind of issue to think about are the justice population has a disproportionate rate of underlying medical illnesses, and in adult facilities of elderly people. Sorry, I warned you guys this was going to be my longer answer, but I have more to say, so I'm going to
keep going.
So in terms of the numbers, so what is the scope of the pandemic? So we've all been hearing that New York is being hit really hard by COVID-19. We've all seen the reports, we've heard the firsthand accounts. The infection rate in Rikers Jail in New York, which houses adults and youth, is at least 7 times higher than in the city. So just to give you a sense of what outbreak looks like in corrections compared to in the community, the risk in corrections is inherently higher, and that's true for youth detention facilities also. In terms of the total count of cases, I'm very grateful to my colleague at UCLA, Sharon Dolovich, and her team. They have been actually doing this painstaking effort of tracking all the COVID cases in corrections that are publicly reported. So it's hard to get information, but many facilities are publicly reporting. So as of today, there are in adult facilities 23,000 documented cases in staff and residents, and 240 deaths, including one facility that's already reporting 13 deaths. In terms of youth correctional facilities, and I can give everybody the link Sharon has it available on a Google Docs Excel spreadsheet that everybody can look at. There are 19 states in the US reporting cases of COVID-19 in youth correctional facilities. And that includes 92 staff cases and 62 cases in incarcerated adolescents. And as a lot of you have probably heard, there have been some staff cases in LA County, and to date, no cases in LA County incarcerated youth. And importantly, the numbers are just going up. We are not seeing a downtrend. A downtrend is not in sight, and it's really important for health professionals to collaborate with our legal colleagues like Patricia to try to solve this quickly. So in terms of the incarcerated youth population, and kind of, Taylor, getting more directly to your question of what are the health issues facing the kids. So all of that was to say, a short answer is that youth in detention facilities have a heightened risk of contracting COVID-19. The good news is that adolescents tend to fare better with COVID-19 from the data that we've seen compared to any other age group. But we need to remember that adolescents can become seriously ill from COVID-19 and even die. Another big concern, which is really closely interrelated with the kind of action that I think needs to happen, is that, as I mentioned, people in the justice system, and including youth in the juvenile justice system, have higher rates of medical illness. The Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, has defined conditions that are higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19. And asthma is on that list, as is smoking history. And those two conditions we see, relatively frequently. So the asthma rate in the general population is about 20%. 10%. And in a correctional population is about 20%. So twofold risk of having an illness that creates a higher susceptibility to severe illness from COVID-19. Another issue is pregnancy. Pregnancy is sort of debated in the medical literature in terms of whether it increases risk from COVID-19. The most recent literature shows that it doesn't increase risk to the pregnant mother. There is some concern that there might be some risk to the fetus. Another issue is we really don't know that much about the epidemiology of COVID-19, and there's a big concern about asymptomatic carriers. So while it's great that adolescents do well and tend to not develop any symptoms, or if they do get symptoms, it's mild illness, it's also quite tricky, because until we start screening everybody, and I mean screening with testing, not just with symptoms, we are not going to know who's carrying the illness and transmitting it. There's also last medical issue to raise is there is some data suggesting that there may be some long-term organ damage from infection with COVID-19. People are just beginning to talk about that. Aside from the medical risks, I think there are major mental health concerns with COVID-19 in corrections. So I think, as we all know, kids in the juvenile justice system, for many different reasons, do have higher rates of mental illness and vulnerabilities. A significant number of youth have anxiety. They have histories of trauma. And what's happening right now is very frightening. It's really stressful for the kids. Another related issue is that when youth do need to be put in isolation in a facility because of having symptoms that may be COVID-19, a lot of times, even with the best intentions of probation, that isolation will resemble solitary confinement to the kids, and so that can be quite difficult. And then there are also concerns with kids' wellness. Just because it's, this is challenging for us. Imagine what it's like to be 16 and be in a detention center. So as we all know, they've had reductions in their educational programming. They can't see their families right now. They're having to wear a mask at all times. So when you or I go out and we go to a public place, we have to wear a mask. The kids are being given masks, which is great. But because they're always around people, and that's the inherent risk of being in a correctional setting, there's that constant stress and risk of transmission and need to protect yourself. So I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions later or now.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. That was incredible. Patricia, any thoughts on what Liz shared, or do you want to move into some of the legal issues that you're seeing come up as a result of COVID-19 for our kids?
I think I'll do a little bit of both. Liz covered so much, and we've worked together in the past. She's one of my favorite experts to work with, and so she's covered a lot of ground. I'll try not to repeat. But just to add, 25%, and I think that number has stayed pretty consistent, of deaths in LA County have occurred in institutional settings. And that includes institutional settings, lockups. And although 0 youth in juvenile institutions have tested positive, and 12 probation youth have as of yesterday, this set of circumstances, I think, really calls for us not to wait until it gets bad or worse, right? That what we know about this virus, and in fact, I think one of the takeaways for the juvenile justice context is that we are operating under extenuating circumstances, but in many ways, this is putting a spotlight on existing issues, right? Many of these issues are not new, including the health concerns in institutional settings, including the difficulty of addressing health concerns in juvenile camps and halls. And many of the legal issues that I will frame for us in thinking about the same concerns that Liz raises are also not new. So really, this is not just about young people. This is also about staff, right, who are exposed. This is about families that get exposed when staff and youth go in and out of these facilities. And that starts to implicate our whole community. It starts to implicate our healthcare system, which our leaders at the national, state, local levels have made very clear could be easily overwhelmed, and in many ways are currently overwhelmed if we don't contain this virus. But I think more broadly speaking, that has always been a concern. The way that we have invested in criminal and juvenile justice systems, really punishment systems, I think to the detriment of investing in health, education, community systems, means that we have to sort of dig ourselves out of a hole. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what I see as pre-COVID youth justice issues, and then during COVID, how many of these get highlighted, accelerated, right? The demands for reforms that we have always asked for are accelerated under this state of emergency, and the legal issues that help us understand why we have to do something. So pre-COVID, I want to paint a landscape of youth justice to understand that there has been such widespread call for reform, right? That there has been recognition that at best, the youth justice system in many ways does not work to achieve youth rehabilitation or public safety, and at worst, causes harm and trauma to young people, exacerbates existing traumas and harms. That there was already a downward trend, thankfully, over the last decade or so in the numbers of young people at every stage of criminal justice processing, right? From arrest to prosecution to detention to transfer to adult court. And that was happening already at the state level, right? We went from 11 state youth prisons back in the mid-2000s, a population of about 10,000, to now a state youth prison system population of about 600, around between 600 to 700 and 3 institutions. So those are positive trends. And even in the last 5 to 7 years, we saw further really drastic declines in the rates of arrest, prosecution, detention, all across the board. And so Los Angeles, alongside these efforts to really reduce our reliance on arrest and court processing, have continued to re-examine, reimagine our youth justice system. And one big focal point of reimagining has been around our probation system. And that's occurred for a number of reasons. The probation system is the system that supervises young people. It is the system that runs institutions, right? So our juvenile halls and camps that lock young people up pre and post adjudication, which is pre and post trial essentially, are run by our probation systems. And when we downsized this very, very massive youth state prison system, we basically transferred responsibility and we transferred money to our county level systems. And over time, our probation systems grew. We wanted to keep them closer to home, so it made sense in many ways. We wanted to keep them out of lockup as much as possible, and our probation system is responsible for keeping young people in the community as well as running these institutions. So they have many, many functions. They have about a $1 billion budget, about 6,000 employees. It's a massive department, and therefore deserves a lot of attention, both in terms of how youth fare in that system, as well as the labor that works on the front lines within that system. And the juvenile institutions have become one of really the most scrutinized parts of the probation system. Last year, the Department of Mental Health issued a report that I want to just quote one sentence from in April 2019. It described the county's juvenile justice system as the product of a juvenile incarceration model that is flawed and fundamentally fails to adequately meet the current developmental needs and mental health needs of youth and their families. Outdated facilities and high levels of use of force create an environment that is not conducive to the overall well-being of youth, and also frustrates efforts to provide effective services and programming. And it goes on to say that any effort, really, I think, dedicated effort by a therapist, a probation officer, anyone working with a young person in a 100-year-old facility like Central Juvenile Hall, any incremental progress they make is immediately eroded by the physical plant itself, by the culture, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about the toxic culture within those institutions, and it's just really hard to imagine achieving any element of rehabilitation in those facilities despite our best efforts. And that's pre-COVID. So now I want to take us to this current moment where we really just need to look at 3 areas that Liz has already highlighted in some ways to understand why there are legal challenges happening all over the state, including in LA. And in full disclosure, I am an attorney on one of these challenges representing 2 legal offices on behalf of all detained youth in juvenile housing camps currently, and that case is live. It's before the LA Superior Court. We filed it in the California Supreme Court, and are really trying to spotlight 3 areas: conditions, and conditions includes what Liz has talked about in terms of adequate safeguards to ensure that young people are not knowingly exposed to COVID-19, and that recognizing that this is very difficult to implement in any institution, certainly if it's overcrowded, even if it's not overcrowded. And then those safeguards also take into account not just the physical risk of being exposed, but the mental health toll that this takes on young people in this like atmosphere of anxiety, and sometimes not having adequate information. But part of conditions also is just the erosion of school programming, counseling, visitation, any sort of meaningful, consistent connection to outside support, including their families, has also been so eviscerated that it is hard to imagine the benefit of being detained, if we can even imagine conceding that there's some benefit outweighs the risks. So conditions is a huge area of concern, but also access to justice, right? That in LA County, we have, I might get it wrong, but it's something like 18 juvenile courts, and only about half of them are operating right now. And not even all of them are operating at full capacity. They have had to alter their procedures. So everything from filing a motion to appearing to having an opportunity as a defense attorney to talk to your client right before court and confer. All of those are harder. There's a lot of confusion. So access to justice is a huge problem. And then the third is looking at the ultimate decision making. And it's a really an opportunity, like I keep saying, not a new issue, to really rethink the standard we should use in deciding whether to detain or incarcerate youth. And in fact, the Judicial Council, which is the policy arm of our state court system, in early April, reminded juvenile courts that they have very wide discretion. I mean, they have a lot of decision-making power in ensuring that detention is a very exceptional practice. So that's something that's a principle already codified in our statutes and laws. And really codified in international human rights and international children's rights instruments like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? That when we remove young people from their home and lock them up, it should be a last resort and used only in the rarest instances. And arguably, we've already overused detention and incarceration prior to COVID-19, but we should really examine that standard even more carefully and liberally under these circumstances. So our argument is that current law permits release as a presumption, and that under these circumstances, under this emergency, we should presume release of young people even more so. So we sort of work backwards. We would presume release, and then we have to overcome that presumption by showing that a young person cannot somehow be safely released home. So the legal framework really is the 14th and 8th Amendments of our federal Constitution. The 14th Amendment guarantees due process. The 8th Amendment guarantees that we are free from basically unreasonable punishment, cruel and unusual punishment. And for youth, what this means, what the courts have interpreted this to mean, is that youth in detention cannot be exposed to either unreasonable risks or conditions amounting to punishment. And then really on top of the federal Constitution, we have our state constitution, we have state statutes. And our state constitution also repeats that young people cannot be exposed to cruel or unusual punishment. And our state statutes say the purpose of our juvenile justice system is to rehabilitate. They are also entitled to be kept in the community as much as possible. And if they are removed from home, they should be kept in a home-like environment. And so we argue under the federal Constitution, under the state constitution, under the state statutes, all of this is so compromised that we have to release as many young people as possible. Really, every young person that can be safely released, we should be looking to release. And research and lived experience of young people and their families who have been system involved really back up, what the law says, right? This is sort of like common sense that young people fare better in the community if we can give them adequate supports there. And then the last thing I'll say before passing it back and answering questions is, alongside this framework that tells us that we have to make sure that young people's basically right to rehabilitation is happening, that they're not being exposed to punishment or unreasonable risks, is really thinking about accountability systems. And so this isn't just true of LA County, that the efforts of the systems themselves, of advocates like myself at the state level as well as the local level, are really calling for systems to work better together, right? So frontline workers, probation officers, Liz, defense attorneys like myself, therapists, whoever, right, is directly working with young people. They are doing oftentimes the best they can within a system that really needs to be improved and transformed. And that's part of what CDF does, is really look at these issues at the system level. So at the system level, we also have to re-examine who has the authority to do what and who has responsibility. And there's a lot of sort of confusion in the midst of all of this, or maybe kind of calling on each other and sometimes pointing fingers at each other. So at the state level, that implicates our Attorney General, our governor, the legislature, the Board of State and Community Corrections. It's an administrative agency that is really charged with standards, guarding standards of all 58 counties' juvenile halls and camps and lockups. At the local level, we're in conversation with and holding accountable our Board of Supervisors, our courts, our probation department, our legal offices, our health systems that have a hand in being present inside these facilities, and even our community members are part of this accountability system, right? So when it comes down to it, when we are calling for the release of a young person and the pushback is, well, we're not confident that their home is a good place to return to, right? That is an opportunity to look at shared responsibility and accountability all around, right? What do we expect a family to provide in the way of a safe and productive home, and what supports can we provide them? And then what should the court system and probation system and the the lawyers working with young people and families do to ensure that happens as well. So it really, I think, is an opportunity to think about lines of accountability, how we make decisions, the standards we should use, and reinforce in this moment about really using incarceration as a last resort, and then thinking about access to justice, and then ensuring that the very small number of young people we might concede for the moment, that we're not going to let them out, that they are really kept under safe conditions and have meaningful rehabilitation going on. I also went on for quite some time.
It's beautiful to hear your remarks, and really the compassion and just expertise that both of you have is stunning. And I sat here like in astonishment that we have your presence here today, both of you. So thank you for that. I have a couple of follow-up questions. I'm just wondering if you can perhaps respond briefly. Liz, you mentioned that the youth are wearing masks, and I wondered if you happen to know what type of education the youth are receiving. Patricia, you know as well, what type of education and information are they getting as to, why they're wearing the mask, and perhaps, why they're not seeing family or not having school or and just wonder what that looks like for the youth on the ground.
And that's a great question. When I do my clinical work at Juvenile Hall, I'm really there as a one-on-one pediatrician. I've also in my scholarship have been following the information that probation has been sharing in the LA County Department of Health Services and Department of Public Health. And so the probation reports, which are available on their website, say that the kids are getting a mask every day, and that they received educational information about the mask, about COVID. I will say, I don't know what information the kids are getting. When I have interacted with them clinically, I always offer to answer any questions that they have about COVID, and they tell me that they don't have questions.
Patricia, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think in our work, it's always important to think in terms of policy as well as implementation. So practice and implementation. And it's one thing to set policy, and it's another to ensure that that policy is being implemented and implemented well. And that's why we need systems of accountability, right? These are very large systems. There's no doubt that every system has had to scramble given how fast COVID-19 has evolved and given the magnitude of crisis, right? So I think it's not just the juvenile justice system, it's all sorts of systems that have been sort of exposed in terms of their inefficiencies or their inabilities to move fast given an emergency or a crisis. So I am in regular touch in the context of both policy work and this litigation with attorneys on the front lines who are in touch with their clients day to day. And I think it's safe to say that the implementation of these policies is uneven at best, right? Mm-hmm. And the policy has, in some cases, have been slow to emerge. So it was for some time. I think it's important to recognize and admit that the availability of masks or any sanitation products were very slow to come into being in the halls and camps, right? So young people were reporting eating together and playing sports together, no masks, no social distancing, no hand sanitizers. And although there was a health inspection team sent into the institutions, we're unsure of what they saw and then what was implemented consistently thereafter. I think the information I am getting from attorneys, for instance, as of this morning, an attorney went into court and learned that his client had been in quarantine, and the young person didn't really know why she was in quarantine. her parents, her family was not informed, nor was the attorney informed for several weeks. And it was almost happenstance that the attorney learned. And it was shared by the probation officer that they didn't have the attorney's phone number, and that they had tried the family several times but was unable to reach them. And there's some contested facts about what was true there. But I think this makes a larger point that there's a lot of scramble here, and there is a lot of confusion. There are a lot of policies to implement and imperfect implementation. That is why I think the highest level priority for us has been to reduce the population as much as possible. This is just not a system set up typically to necessarily do programming, access to justice, or health measures well, and certainly not in this sort of crisis. In terms of education, I'll just say quickly that the probation department had asked for sort of something called a waiver. There are state regulations governing things like education and programming, and they had asked, understandably in some ways, for a waiver because it would be too hard to comply with state regulations like requirements around education and programming, while also trying to decrease movement and contact between people. And but I think the alternative to provide young people with distance learning has also exposed our inefficiencies and the need to scramble that doesn't quite look like a scramble at the county level. So I know that LACO supports release, or LA County Office of Education really supports release as a first order of protection of young people, and in the meantime is getting up and running some sort of distance learning, but it's happening very slowly and just being piloted on a small scale, but is not available to all young people.
You mentioned other conditions that have changed in light of COVID, such as counseling, school programming, or extracurriculars, visitation with family. I'm wondering if you can comment briefly on, what it looks like for the youth day to day. For those of us who've, been in the facilities and seen how they operate, they're very regimented schedules. The kids, they wake up, they eat, they go to school, they eat, they go back to school, they do sports, they do homework, they have free time, lights out, something along those lines. And I'm wondering what it looks like for them now, just on a very practical level, if either of you happen to know.
Liz, you want to start, or you want me to start?
I really have been focusing on what's been happening in the medical module, and I don't have as much information about what's happening on the units. Yeah, go ahead, Patricia.
I think through our legal office's partners, the report has been consistent that, one, there is a lot of idle time. That's just true across institutions. It's true as part of cutting back exposure and not having so many people coming in and out. So there's a lot of idle time, which is very inconsistent with what we know in terms of best practices, that the more structured, productive programming young people have, the better they do. So a lot of down idle time. That's probably also why there is continued activity. There are continued activities like communal sports, right? Like group sports and being in the rec room together. And this is just an example of the tension we have here, right? To be able to do anything inside an institution that really needs like minimal movement and exposure to each other, the alternative also looks bad and risky. In terms of therapy, I know that it had been paused, and it sounds like there are efforts to make remote therapy and some in-person therapy available. Same thing with education, that it had been paused, and then there were just packets that young people were getting from week to week, sometimes the same packets, so not very meaningful education. And then the LA County Office of Education has really put in a lot of effort to try to improve that education. But by and large, it's just reduced. It's, I think we might agree, insufficient, and it's been uneven. In the way of visitation through phone calls home, I can only imagine how many phones are actually available. And so that might look like a 5 to 10 minute conversation, once or twice a week with your family. And at least one attorney reported that his developmentally challenged client who is nonverbal means all he can do is hold up the phone. They hold up the phone for him and he just hears his parents talk. He can't see them. I mean, it's really so scaled back that even for someone who can communicate, how meaningful and how consistent that contact is really called into question. And certainly with a young person with any condition that challenges that communication on top of existing conditions is really just, I think, saddening.
Yeah. Thank you both. I really want to acknowledge and thank Patricia for sort of outlining the pre-COVID landscape in our facilities and understanding that they were challenged in many ways but prior to this, and that the circumstances for probation have increased tenfold in terms of the challenges, if not significantly more so, and acknowledge how truly difficult it must be to operate under these circumstances, not only for the youth, but for the staff, for the partnered organizations such as DMH and LACO, and many others. I'm sure it is incredibly difficult and also frankly frightening to be dealing with these circumstances in the course of a day's work. And so thank you both for highlighting all of that and really for sharing the reality of what's happening with I think a deep empathy for the system itself. And I thank you both for that, because this is rather difficult for everyone, and I don't think anyone wants it to be this way. So I thank you for acknowledging those challenges on all sides. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about what you see down the road with respect to sort of life after COVID, if you will, or life in between COVID experiences, with respect to current arrests, future detention of youth, and some of the unique ways that we should be thinking about doing business going forward, to perhaps ameliorate some of these issues, or address them as they come up. Want to start, Liz?
Sure. I also want to add on to what you were saying, Taylor, for the correctional workforce. I think it's not just difficult or frightening, but there is a risk. And the correctional workforce, a lot of people are in the age group where there is a vulnerability to severe illness, to COVID-19. And so I just want to acknowledge all of the probation staff and everybody else that's in the facilities every day taking care of the kids. You think about when we've been hearing about the essential workers and the thank yous, we are not hearing about the correctional health workers, but all of those risks that I outlined, the public health risks in correctional facilities, are faced by the people that go there to work every day. And I absolutely agree that we're operating in, I would say, near impossible circumstances, or maybe, if you follow what Patricia's saying, impossible circumstances to do what's best for the kids if you keep them there. In terms of what this is going to look like long term, I absolutely agree with Patricia that the juvenile justice system, we all know that it wasn't working great, that kids were not having better outcomes as a result of coming out of the juvenile justice system. So it's really critical that we optimize the system as much as possible. And to the extent that we get a break from COVID, it's really important that we're not putting extra kids into the system that don't need to be there. And in terms of all the public health forecasts and the input I've gotten from experts around the country, it sounds like the best guess is that we're going to be, in this phase of heightened risk until sometime in the summer. Risk is likely to pick up again into the fall, and then we're likely to be, I know this is being recorded, you could play it back in 2 years and say I was fully wrong, but it's likely that we're going to be at heightened risk until there's a vaccine readily available and the majority of the population is immunized so that we have herd immunity, which is predicted to be about 18 months away. So we are still in a critical phase. There might be a bit of a break, but we need to prepare for this being a long-term process.
Yeah, it's so sobering to hear these timelines. I think like with every benchmark, like May 15th, the stay-at-home order may be lifted, to be reminded that this is an ongoing crisis and that we have to not too readily abandon these, very cautious efforts to contain the virus. I echo the calls for just releasing as many young people as possible that don't need to be there. Arguably, I would suggest that no young person needs to be in something like a central juvenile hall given its conditions, but really to pare down this system to as small of a footprint we can possibly make it under the current conditions, and then to take precautions and ensure some level of adequate programming inside. But really alongside that, there are already efforts that we should maintain our focus on and ensure our follow through with. And those are building up alternatives. So the other big project that I am a consultant for is trying to reimagine juvenile probation altogether. And the Board of Supervisors in LA County had unanimously passed a motion last August to really call on a work group to design a way to remove young people from juvenile probation and put it under a different authority, a different department, maybe a new department. And that might look like transferring a lot of the functions and workers of the probation department to this reimagined system. And it really calls on probation workers who know the system inside out to reimagine alongside with us. What functions do they think are most important? What conditions and supports and standards do they believe need to surround their job to do the best job with young people? And then same thing with protections and standards around young people and what they deserve. But I think this opportunity to quickly downsize our system and then stay the course on transforming it so that we don't have to choose between juvenile hall and a perceived risk in the community, that we have a range of options that are really both about safety of young people, the well-being of young people, as well as the community. So I think all of the work that's already happened, diverting more young people, doing more re-entry work, having community-based supports, because those are the ones that young people will stick with long after their system involvement, that there is infrastructure to coordinate with those community-based systems, even when they're system involved, to try to avoid system involvement altogether and then to keep them out of the system once they leave.
Thank you, Patricia, and thanks, Liz, as well. Just to circle back on a couple of things that you mentioned regarding the visits, are they primarily happening, like you said, over the phone? That's it? There aren't Zoom visits, there aren't in-person visits or anything else happening with respect to visits?
No, not as far as I've learned.
Okay. And then, of course.
I wanted to share two stories, if that was okay, about young people that I met, just because it's getting late in the conversation and it relates to everything that Patricia has been saying. So, and to your question about, long term, what does this look like and what do we need to do? So during my most recent clinical shift, I was doing an admission exam for a young man who was nearly detained. So anytime a kid comes into juvenile hall, they see a pediatrician and they have a whole history and physical. And I was asking him his story for why he landed in juvenile hall, not because of the legal implications, but just so that in my role as a pediatrician, I can help him think through his choices and guide him to being on track. And I will kind of jump ahead in the exam. I noticed that he had scars on his back that, were possibly from trauma a long time ago, but I couldn't get him to talk about it. But a story for why he was in juvenile hall, he said that he had been evicted from his home, and he had been trying to find a job and couldn't find a job because of COVID, and he specifically cited COVID. And because he didn't want to ask his mother for money, he didn't want to burden her by asking for money, that he did attempt to steal something. So this is, maybe can lead into the next series of talks, but what the pediatric community is saying is that COVID, in terms of children's health, it's not so much of a direct impact. The big concern is the indirect impact and the poverty that we are already starting to see, but because everybody's in this lockdown state, we can't really capture it. But this is a huge concern and relates so much to youth justice, because we all know who ends up in the justice system is, by far disproportionately, it's the children from families of low socioeconomic backgrounds. The second, so I'll let that sit, and then I just want to tell my second story before I forget. So I think it's amazing, Patricia, you have such an amazing legal framework, and it's so striking to me that we came to the exact same conclusion of, we need to get as many kids out as possible. I was not thinking about the legal issues. I was thinking purely from a public health standpoint, what makes the most sense to protect the health of young people in America. In terms of the specific decarceration strategy, I absolutely agree with you that, you want to focus on who already shouldn't have been there in the pre-COVID context and what makes sense with this legal framework. But we are at this new point in time where we also need to think about medical vulnerability. That is not something that judges were trained how to do. And I can't make these decisions, and doctors can't make these decisions by ourselves, because we're not trained to think about the public safety aspects and the other ramifications. So there needs to be a true partnership. So the story that I want to tell you is, it's been twice now that I've been contacted by defense attorneys saying, there is a young person with asthma, and we are very concerned that this young person is in juvenile hall. The judge has denied release because the judge says that there is no evidence that asthma increases risk for severe COVID infection. So, which is actually not true. Asthma is on the CDC guidelines. So we helped the judge obtain a letter from a pulmonologist just stating nothing about, specific about the kids. Asthma increases the risk of COVID. And a week later, the kid was released. I know that Department of Health Services has been working with probation, and Department of Public Health has recommendations for release. But then I got the second, can you help another kid with asthma? And it's just becoming increasingly clear that this is not something that should be happening on a case-by-case basis. We need to figure out a systematic way to incorporate these concerns of medical vulnerability into these judicial decisions. I don't know the answer to that, but the story of that kid who was released and went home to his foster family to house arrest, which looks like what the rest of us are doing, is, being at home.
Taylor, can I also give another story, provide another story?
Do all the talking you want. We can stay here all day listening to both of you. You're incredible. Thank you. Please carry on.
Yeah, just to supplement that, the way the individual advocacy is operating, does look so individualized and case by case. And this is our call for something more systematic, expedited, and categorical, and that ensures that there's consistency across decision making in the courtroom and by probation and all others, doesn't displace that, I think, all the hard work that's already happening. And I know the justice partners, many of them have not taken a day off since this crisis emerged. But this morning, an attorney was in court arguing for the release of a young person in camp. And the judge denied the release, saying that there's no evidence he's in great danger and that no kid has tested positive yet at the camp facility. And the prosecutor in that case actually jumped in with the defense attorney to say that he had evaluated the risk of him being exposed versus the benefits of why he's at camp, and that he was in for property crimes only, that given the decrease in services, that there was a diminished value in him being there. He had been there since October, so had already spent a significant amount of time inside. And the DA himself was nervous about seeing him in for another month or so wasn't opposed to release, and then he was released. But it is an upward climb, right? Like, this is not an easy effort. I know that there are a lot of collaborative efforts. There's even advocacy by prosecution, as in this case, and by probation itself to call for release. And I don't think there is a shared standard and appreciation of what constitutes risk. And that's why we need systems level accountability and assurances, right? That we are all applying, I think, the same level of urgency and standards and information to these decisions that happen day to day.
Yeah, thank you both so much for telling the stories of the youth and also the attorneys, advocates, and others working with our young people. As you know, we had a number of questions to go over today, but since we're nearing the end of our call, one of the questions was really going to be about policy recommendations. But I think based on this discussion, it's clear that the goal is really to reduce the population to the extent possible in every way. Come up with a variety of options with regard to future placement arrangements. And though this wasn't stated specifically as a policy recommendation, but it really seems to me that incorporating technology for visits, for activities potentially, as well as for school would be greatly appreciated by the young people, if not by the staff and those working there as well. I also really want to thank Liz for highlighting the indirect trickle down, if you will, I'll call it that, that this is really resulting in for our kids, with families not being working and other challenges, kids not being in school. That was really something I wanted to talk about as well. The fact that kids aren't in school, having all this free time, the likelihood that amounts to some type of activity that is deemed criminal and then they end up being arrested, I think is another thing we need to have in mind going forward. But with that said, it's 1 o'clock. We're at the end of our talk, and I really want to thank you both, not only for your expertise, but more than anything for the empathy and the compassion that you have for the kids, their families, and these systems. It's so apparent, and we're very grateful to both of you for joining us today. We see that evidenced as well by the participants. I know everyone here is really thankful for the information that you shared. To everybody who asked questions, we're sorry we didn't get to all of them, but you know that you can always email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and we're happy to follow up with you on anything that you need. And again, let's give our participants a round of applause, our panelists, and thank them so much for their expertise and for their advocacy and for their care. We are so grateful. Thank you both. And with that, we are signing off.